The Mohawk Valley in upper New York State was the home of the Fort Hunter Mohawks until after the Battle of Oriskany in August 1777. They made their way to Lachine and stayed there until the spring of 1784. Lyman Draper was a librarian and historian in Wisconsin. He spent much of his life collecting material for a series of biographies, and in 1879, while researching for a planned biography of Joseph Brandt, he contacted several members of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. While in the community, he spoke to several people and recorded the oral history as it had been passed down to them. Mr. Draper died before he could write the biographies, but his notes were preserved. What follows is taken from his notes. It is a wonderful resource that lets us hear 19th century voices of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. Some described how the Mohawks left Mohawk Valley. The stories do not always match exactly, but the overall feeling is that when the Fort Hunter Mohawks had to leave Mohawk Valley, they suffered greatly. Lydia was a daughter of Catherine Hill from Captain Isaac Hill and Lydia John. Her mother was very young at the time of leaving the Mohawk Valley. Her testimony is dated the 28th of September, 1879.
When the war broke out, the Mohawks resolved to take the king's side, and all the nations started, save a few families. I believe only 3 for Lachine, where they would be safe, as Brandt was the object of the Americans. He was placed in front, and all trudged along. My mother was then but 3 years old, and used to relate that they would stop at some of the houses by the way and get buttermilk. The only food they took with them was parched cornmeal, called in the Mohawk language onungwatsara, of which each carried as much as he could. They were pursued by the Americans, and 6 Mohawk women, lagging behind with their heavy loads, were overtaken and made prisoners. They were put in prison and kept a long time, suffering much during their incarceration.
George was a son of Henry and Jemima Loft. Henry's father was David Loft, who was not a Mohawk, but his sons Henry and John settled with the Mohawks. His testimony is dated the 30th of September, 1879.
George Roguaho Loft. My grandfather was a St. Francis Indian, Garunyagigoa, or the Big Clear Sky. He was the pilot sent to conduct the Mohawks from the Mohawk Valley to Lachine, of which I can give no particulars. He served till the end of the war. When the British troops left Canada, an officer, David Loft, who was on very friendly terms with my grandfather, Garunyagigoa, exchanged names with him and had a great feast on the occasion. Hence the origin of the Loft name among the Mohawks. My grandfather had 2 sons, John and Henry. On some occasion, it would seem about 1775, Washington spoke beautifully, saying, "Stay with me. You did not cause the war. It was the result of differences between me and the British. You stay and share with me. If I prosper, you shall prosper. Be one with us." But the Mohawks said among themselves, "We have pledged faith with our British fathers, and we must keep it. We will go over the lake to Canada," and so left the Mohawk country. They brought their old church bell with them, on evidence of their devotion to their religious teachings, for it must have cost them much toil and labor, and is now in the church near Mill Point.
Margaret was a daughter of John Green. He had served in the American Revolution and the War of 1812. Her testimony is dated the 6th of October, 1879.
My father, John Green, died in 1845 at 110 years. He was a chief, went in at 1814 for defense of Kingston. Captain John was then dead. He first went upon the warpath at 14 and was much under Sir William Johnson. When the Mohawks retired from the Mohawk Valley, they went via Caughnawaga to Canada, the braves in the rear guarding the women and children. My father, John Green, among them, were pursued a considerable distance. I don't remember any fighting, but 6 Mohawk women and 1 child were taken by the Americans, and one afterwards, Mrs. Seth Powless, who lived to be aged. The party suffered greatly for want of provisions. The removal, 1776, when the war became troublesome, 2 Mohawk women and a child were taken from their houses at night. The next morning, as there were no men at home, 4 young women or girls went on a distant hill to make such discoveries as they could, whether a body of Americans were coming. And when they returned, The other women and children of the settlement had all gone, and these 4 girls were captured. The warriors joined the women for their protection in the journey to Lachine.
Thomas Green was the brother of Margaret Green Moses and son of John Green. He was one of the last life chiefs as recognized by the Department of Indian Affairs. His testimony is dated the 6th of October, 1879.
The Americans wanted the Mohawks to remain at their homes and take no part in the war, but so firmly attached were they to the king that they would not listen to this advice. They started to retire in a body to Canada. Captain John was in the rear to protect the women and children. They were overtaken and attacked on the way, and those in front fell back to aid the rear guard, and Captain John was wounded. I believe there were some white commanders with the Indians, but do not know their names. Captain John was wounded in the thigh. I believe the fight was on the land and not while crossing a river. My father, John Green, was along. If pursued over any river, I think it must have been the Mohawk. The retreating Indians became nearly starved. Children would cry of hunger, camped out, and the Indian hunters went out in every direction to hunt, killing only a few birds, and made them into gruel, so as to go as far as possible, but afforded the hungry scarcely a spoonful apiece, with small bits of the scanty meat. They were then nearly 2 days' travel to Lachine, and without food. The journey was tardy, as the children who could had to walk in their feebled condition, and the smaller ones had to be carried.
Elizabeth was a daughter of Catherine Hill from Captain Isaac Hill and Lydia John. She was a sister to Mrs. Lydia Loft Martin, and was married to Seth Powless, who was one of the last life chiefs. Her testimony is dated the 6th of October, 1879.
The removal from the Mohawk Valley to Lachine was about 1776. There were a few men to guide the women and children. American Indians followed and overtook them and killed some, once on an island, and killed 3 of ours. Margaret Pinn, who was married to Seth Powless when young, was captured and kept prisoner a while. The group finally got to the Seneca chief, Gyanguacta, and stayed some time. I was 15 when I found my surviving kindred, 2 younger brothers. Those who fled from the Mohawk Valley had only parched corn and suffered every hardship.
Anne was the daughter of Peter Brandt, who belonged to the Delaware Nation. Her father and his brother, Brandt, fought as allies to the British in the American Revolution. Delawares were with the Fort Hunter Mohawks at Lachine. Their families came down to the Bay of Quinte in 1784. Anne's testimony is dated 7th of October, 1879.
My father, Peter Brandt, was wounded twice in the same fight. The first time he fell, and his brother Brandt carried him away, and was wounded again while being carried, both times in the same leg, so that he had a stiff knee ever after. This was early in the war, perhaps on a scout. He was taken to Fort Niagara and remained in the hospital a good while. Captain John was wounded at the same time in the retreat from Mohawk Valley to Canada. My father's wound frequently broke out for as long as he lived. He drew a pension of a York shilling a day. He died about 1815 at about 60 years of age. He had 8 children, and I was the youngest. My uncle, Brandt, was older than my father, Peter, and there was only these 2 brothers. My grandparents and others of the family had died before the war. My uncle, Brandt, died about 1804. He left a family, all of whom are now dead. I don't know the names nor the origin of my grandparents, and I don't believe there was any relationship between them and Captain Joseph Brandt. I don't really know. I never heard of anything.
Ellen was the daughter of William Isaac Hill and Nancy Crawford. William Isaac Hill was a son of Captain Isaac Hill. Ellen was the widow of Cornelius Maracle.
I recall the retreat from the Mohawk to Lachine. 3 were killed by pursuing Americans. The Indians ambuscaded in the woods and had a fight when the Americans came up, who were not numerous and were beaten back. My grandfather, Captain Isaac Hill's brother, my great-uncle, was among the killed. The retreat was in the fall of the year, as the Mohawks had large hogs in their pens fattening. These and their cattle they left behind, hiding in the grounds such valuables as they could not carry. These losses were made good by the British government. I have no recollection of women having been captured.
Catherine was the daughter of Joseph Brandt Jr. and Margaret John. She was a grandchild of both Captain John Desrantiun and Joseph Brandt. She married John W. Hill, who was a grandson of Captain Isaac Hill. Her testimony is dated the 6th to the 8th of October, 1879.
The Canada migration was probably in the fall of 1776, when the Mohawks left the Mohawk River. They would carry the small children on their shoulders and large packs. They sat down on the southern shore of the St. Lawrence, saw a large boat approaching them, well manned with oarsmen and many oars. The Mohawk women, fearing it was a party of Americans, began to cry, but at length they espied red colors and other British indications, and dried up their tears. It proved to be Sir John Johnson, and all rejoiced as they knew him. And he piloted them to a suitable place, Lachine, and supplied them their almost famishing necessities.
Ya Kenhtè